Covenant merely personal, inventored servitude in America. Covenant merely personal refers to a legal term that describes an agreement that is based on the personal relationship between two parties rather than the transfer of property or rights. This type of covenant was commonly used in early American history to establish relationships between indentured servants and their masters. Indentured servitude was a system of labor that was widely used in colonial America from the 17th to the 19th century. Under this system, individuals would agree to work for a certain period of time, usually between 4 and 7 years, in exchange for passage to America and the promise of land or other rewards at the end of their term. Indentured servants were typically poor, unskilled laborers who were seeking a better life in the colonies. The relationship between an indentured servant and their master was established through a covenant, which was a formal agreement that outlined the terms and conditions of the servant's labor. These covenants were often based on a personal relationship between the servant and their master, rather than on the transfer of property or rights. One of the key features of a covenant merely personal was that it was not transferable. This meant that the agreement only applied to the specific individuals involved and could not be passed on to anyone else. For example, if an indentured servant died before the end of their term, their contract would not be transferred to their heirs or to another individual. The use of covenant merely personal in indentured servitude was controversial because it created a system of personal relationships between individuals that were often based on unequal power dynamics. Masters had significant control over their servants' lives, including their living conditions, food, and medical care. Servants were often subject to physical punishment and other forms of mistreatment. Despite these problems, indentured servitude persisted in America for several centuries. It was eventually replaced by the system of slavery, which was even more exploitative and dehumanizing. However, the legacy of covenant merely personal continues to influence American legal and social systems today, as we continue to grapple with issues of inequality and power dynamics in our relationships with one another. Indentured servitude was a form of labor that played a significant role in shaping the early American economy and society. It was introduced in the early colonial period as a means of attracting laborers to the colonies and creating a system of indentured labor that would help establish the new settlements. Under this system, individuals would agree to work for a set period of time, usually between 4 and 7 years, in exchange for passage to America and the promise of land or other rewards at the end of their term. Indentured servants were typically poor, unskilled laborers who were seeking a better life in the colonies. The system was widely used throughout the colonial period, and many of the early settlers in America were indentured servants. The relationship between an indentured servant and their master was established through a covenant, which was a formal agreement that outlined the terms and conditions of the servant's labor. These covenants were often based on a personal relationship between the servant and their master, rather than on the transfer of property or rights. One of the key features of a covenant merely personal was that it was not transferable. This meant that the agreement only applied to the specific individuals involved and could not be passed on to anyone else. For example, if an indentured servant died before the end of their term, their contract would not be transferred to their heirs or to another individual. The use of covenant merely personal in indentured servitude was controversial because it created a system of personal relationships between individuals that were often based on unequal power dynamics. Masters had significant control over their servants' lives, including their living conditions, food, and medical care. Servants were often subject to physical punishment and other forms of mistreatment. Despite these problems, indentured servitude persisted in America for several centuries. It was eventually replaced by the system of slavery, which was even more exploitative and dehumanizing. However, the legacy of covenant merely personal continues to influence American legal and social systems today, as we continue to grapple with issues of inequality and power dynamics in our relationships with one another. Indentured servitude in America. Indentured servitude was an integral part of the early American economy, and it played a significant role in shaping the society and culture of the time. The system was introduced in the early colonial period as a means of attracting laborers to the colonies and creating a system of indentured labor that would help establish the new settlements. Indentured servants were typically poor, unskilled laborers who were seeking a better life in the colonies. Many were young men and women who had little or no opportunity for advancement in their home countries, and who saw America as a land of opportunity. Under the system of indentured servitude, individuals would agree to work for a set period of time, usually between 4 and 7 years, in exchange for passage to America and the promise of land or other rewards at the end of their term. The terms of the agreement were spelled out in a formal contract, or covenant, that was signed by both the servant and the master. The covenant established a personal relationship between the servant and the master, and it outlined the terms and conditions of the servant's labor. This included the length of the term, the type of work that the servant would perform, and the rewards that the servant would receive at the end of their term. The covenant also established the power dynamic between the servant and the master. The master had significant control over the servant's life, including their living conditions, food, and medical care. The servant was obligated to work for the master for the entire length of their term, and they could not leave without the master's permission. Covenant merely personal. One of the key features of the covenant in indentured servitude was that it was a covenant merely personal. This meant that the agreement only applied to the specific individuals involved and could not be transferred to anyone else. For example, if an indentured servant died before the end of their term, their contract would not be transferred to their heirs or to another individual. The use of covenant merely personal in indentured servitude was controversial because it created a system of personal relationships between individuals that were often based on unequal power dynamics. Masters had significant control over their servants' lives, including their living conditions, food, and medical care. Servants were often subject to physical punishment and other forms of mistreatment. In some cases, indentured servants were able to successfully complete their term and go on to become free citizens in the colonies. They were able to take advantage of the opportunities that America offered and establish themselves in their new homes. However, for many indentured servants, the system was exploitative and unfair. They were often subjected to harsh working conditions, limited opportunities for advancement, and little or no protection under the law. The system of indentured servitude was eventually replaced by the system of slavery, which was even more dehumanizing and exploitative. Legacy of covenant merely personal. The legacy of covenant merely personal continues to influence American legal and social systems today. The concept of a personal covenant has been used in other areas of law, including employment contracts and other types of agreements between individuals. The issue of power dynamics and unequal relationships between individuals is also still a relevant topic of discussion in modern society. The Me Too movement and other social justice movements have brought attention to issues of harassment, exploitation, and abuse of power in various settings. How people became indentured servants. Indentured servitude was a system of labor that was prevalent in colonial America. The system was established in the early 17th century and continued until the mid-19th century. It was a way for people to migrate to the colonies and gain passage across the Atlantic in exchange for a set number of years of labor. In this article, we will explore how people became indentured servants and the factors that led them to choose this path. Reasons for becoming an indentured servant. There were many reasons why people chose to become indentured servants. One of the main reasons was poverty. Many people in England and other European countries were struggling to make ends meet, and they saw the colonies as a way to start a new life and make a better living. They could not afford to pay for passage to the colonies, so they became indentured servants in exchange for transportation. Another reason people became indentured servants was to escape religious persecution. Many people in Europe were facing persecution for their religious beliefs, and the colonies offered a new start where they could practice their religion freely. Indentured servitude was a way for these people to gain passage to the colonies and start a new life. Some people became indentured servants because they were looking for adventure. They saw the colonies as a place where they could explore and discover new things. Indentured servitude was a way for them to gain passage to the colonies and embark on a new adventure. The process of becoming an indentured servant. The process of becoming an indentured servant was relatively straightforward. First, a person would sign a contract with a master or a ship captain. The contract would outline the terms of the agreement, including the length of service, the type of work that would be performed, and the conditions of the arrangement. Once the contract was signed, the person would be transported to the colonies. The journey across the Atlantic was long and dangerous, and many people did not survive the trip. Those who did make it to the colonies would be put to work immediately. They would perform a variety of tasks, including farming, construction, and domestic work. The length of the indenture varied, but it was usually between 4 and 7 years. During this time, the servant was required to work for the master and was not allowed to leave without permission. In exchange for their labor, the servant was provided with food, clothing, and shelter. After the term of indenture was completed, the servant would be released and could begin a new life in the colonies. Challenges faced by indentured servants. Indentured servitude was a difficult and challenging way of life. The servants faced many challenges, including poor living conditions, harsh working conditions, and limited opportunities for advancement. They were often subject to physical punishment and other forms of mistreatment. The servants also faced challenges when their term of indenture was completed. They were often left with little or no money, and they had to find a way to support themselves. Many servants were unable to find work, and they ended up living in poverty. The growth of indentured servitude. Indentured servitude grew rapidly in colonial America, especially in the Chesapeake Bay region, where tobacco cultivation was the main economic activity. The first wave of indentured servants arrived in the colonies in the early 17th century. These were mostly young, unmarried men from England who were seeking to establish themselves in the colonies. They were recruited by agents who offered them passage across the Atlantic in exchange for a set number of years of labor. As the colonies grew, the demand for labor increased. This led to the recruitment of a broader range of individuals, including women, children, and people from other parts of Europe. The conditions of indenture varied, but in general, servants were required to work for their masters for a period of 4 to 7 years in exchange for passage to the colonies and basic provisions. The impact of indentured servitude on colonial society. Indentured servitude had a profound impact on colonial society. One of the most significant impacts was on the social and economic structure of the colonies. The system created a class of laborers who were tied to their masters for a set number of years. While some servants were able to rise in social and economic status, the majority were not. This created a system of social and economic inequality that persisted for generations. Indentured servitude also contributed to the growth of slavery in the colonies. As the demand for labor increased, some masters turned to the importation of African slaves to meet their needs. While indentured servitude and slavery were not the same, they were closely linked. Both systems relied on the exploitation of labor to generate profits, and both contributed to the growth of the colonial economy. The life of an indentured servant. The life of an indentured servant was harsh and difficult. Servants were required to work long hours, often in dangerous conditions. They were subject to physical punishment and other forms of mistreatment by their masters. Many servants were also subject to sexual exploitation and other forms of abuse. Living conditions for servants were also poor. They were often crowded into small living quarters and provided with minimal provisions. Disease was rampant, and many servants died from illness or other causes during their term of indenture. Despite the challenges, many servants were able to successfully complete their term of indenture and start a new life in the colonies. Some were able to acquire land or establish businesses, while others were able to move up the social and economic ladder. However, the vast majority of servants remained poor and struggled to make ends meet. The legacy of indentured servitude. Indentured servitude ended in the mid-19th century, but its legacy continues to be felt today. The system played a significant role in shaping the social and economic landscape of colonial America, and its impact is still visible in the inequalities that exist in our society. Indentured servitude also contributed to the growth of slavery in the colonies, and the legacy of slavery continues to be felt in our society. The exploitation of labor, which was a hallmark of both systems, has led to persistent economic and social inequality. However, the impact of indentured servitude on colonial society was significant. The system contributed to the growth of social and economic inequality, as well as the growth of slavery in the colonies. Its legacy can still be felt in the persistent inequalities that exist in our society today. It is also important to note that the experience of indentured servants varied depending on a number of factors, such as their gender, age, and country of origin. Women, for example, were often subject to sexual exploitation and abuse, while children were sometimes separated from their families and sent to work as servants. Additionally, while many indentured servants were from England, a significant number were also from other parts of Europe, such as Ireland and Germany. These individuals often faced additional challenges, such as language barriers and cultural differences. How they were treated. Indentured servants were treated differently depending on the individual master and the terms of the indenture contract. However, the life of an indentured servant was generally harsh and difficult. Indentured servants were required to work long hours, often in dangerous conditions. They were subject to physical punishment and other forms of mistreatment by their masters. This included being whipped, beaten, or placed in stocks for disobedience or perceived laziness. Living conditions for servants were also poor. They were often crowded into small living quarters and provided with minimal provisions. Disease was rampant, and many servants died from illness or other causes during their term of indenture. Indentured servants were also subject to sexual exploitation and abuse, especially women. Female servants were often viewed as objects of sexual desire by their masters and were frequently raped or forced into sexual relationships. In some cases, masters were required to provide their servants with basic provisions, such as food and clothing. However, many masters provided their servants with only the bare minimum, leaving them malnourished and poorly clothed. Indentured servants also had few legal rights or protections. They were not allowed to leave their master's service without permission, and they had little recourse if they were mistreated or abused. Despite these challenges, many servants were able to successfully complete their term of indenture and start a new life in the colonies. Some were able to acquire land or establish businesses, while others were able to move up the social and economic ladder. However, the vast majority of servants remained poor and struggled to make ends meet. The treatment of indentured servants varied depending on a number of factors, such as the master's personality, the location of the plantation, and the specific terms of the indenture contract. Some masters treated their servants relatively well, providing them with decent living conditions, adequate food and clothing, and even opportunities for education or advancement. However, many other masters were abusive and cruel, viewing their servants as little more than disposable labor. One of the biggest challenges for indentured servants was the lack of legal protections. Servants were legally bound to their master's service, and they had few avenues for recourse if they were mistreated or abused. Even if a servant could prove that they had been mistreated, it was often difficult to find a sympathetic authority figure who was willing to intervene on their behalf. Many servants also faced challenges related to their ethnicity or nationality. Servants from Ireland or Scotland, for example, were often viewed as being of a lower social status than English servants. This often led to discrimination and mistreatment, both from their masters and from other members of colonial society. Female indentured servants were particularly vulnerable to mistreatment and abuse. Many masters viewed female servants as sexual objects, and rape and sexual abuse were not uncommon. Female servants were also more likely to be subject to physical punishment and other forms of mistreatment. The living conditions for indentured servants were generally poor. Servants were often housed in cramped, unsanitary conditions, and disease was rampant. Malnutrition and starvation were also common, especially during periods of drought or crop failure. Despite these challenges, many indentured servants were able to successfully complete their term of indenture and start a new life in the colonies. Some were able to acquire land or establish businesses, while others were able to move up the social and economic ladder. However, the vast majority of servants remained poor and struggled to make ends meet. Indentured servitude played a significant role in shaping colonial society. It provided a cheap source of labor for plantation owners and other landholders, which in turn helped to fuel the growth of the colonial economy. However, it also contributed to the growth of social and economic inequality, as well as the growth of slavery in the colonies. The legacy of indentured servitude can still be felt in our society today. The persistent social and economic inequalities that exist in the United States can be traced back, in part, to the legacy of indentured servitude and other forms of forced labor. One important aspect of the treatment of indentured servants was the relationship between servants and their masters. In many cases, masters were responsible for providing their servants with basic necessities, such as food, clothing, and shelter. However, this often meant that servants were dependent on their masters for their survival, and had little control over their own lives. In some cases, servants were able to negotiate better terms of their indenture contract. For example, some servants were able to negotiate shorter terms of service or better living conditions. However, this was relatively rare, and most servants were forced to accept whatever terms were offered to them. One common form of mistreatment of indentured servants was physical punishment. Masters often used physical punishment as a means of controlling their servants and enforcing obedience. This could range from relatively minor forms of punishment, such as whipping or beating, to more extreme forms of punishment, such as branding or mutilation. Another form of mistreatment that indentured servants often faced was sexual abuse. Female servants were particularly vulnerable to this form of mistreatment, as many masters viewed them as objects of sexual desire. Some masters even forced their female servants into sexual relationships, and rape was not uncommon. Indentured servants were also subject to various forms of exploitation. For example, masters often paid their servants very little, if anything at all. In some cases, servants were required to work for several years before receiving any payment. This made it difficult for servants to save money and start a new life once their term of indenture was over. The conditions in which indentured servants lived were also often poor. Many servants were housed in cramped, unsanitary conditions, and disease was rampant. Malnutrition and starvation were also common, especially during times of crop failure or other economic hardships. Despite these challenges, many indentured servants were able to make a new life for themselves in the colonies. Some were able to acquire land or establish businesses, while others were able to move up the social and economic ladder. However, the vast majority of servants remained poor and struggled to make ends meet. One important factor in the treatment of indentured servants was the growth of slavery in the colonies. As the demand for labor increased, many masters turned to the slave trade to provide them with a cheap source of labor. This led to the growth of the slave trade in the colonies, and contributed to the growth of racial inequality and injustice. The legacy of indentured servitude can still be felt in our society today. The persistent social and economic inequalities that exist in the United States can be traced back, in part, to the legacy of indentured servitude and other forms of forced labor. It is important to acknowledge and understand this legacy, in order to work towards a more just and equitable society for all. One important aspect to consider when looking at the treatment of indentured servants is the intersection of race and indenture. While many indentured servants were European, there were also significant numbers of African, Native American, and Indian indentured servants. The experiences of these non-European indentured servants were often even harsher than those of their European counterparts. African indentured servants were brought to the colonies through the transatlantic slave trade. Many were sold into indentured servitude for a period of several years, after which they were supposed to be freed. However, in practice, many African servants were not freed at the end of their term of service, but were instead forced into permanent slavery. Native American and Indian indentured servants were often captured during wars or raids and sold into indentured servitude. They faced a variety of challenges, including cultural and linguistic barriers, discrimination, and the loss of their land and resources. Many were also subjected to physical abuse and forced labor. In addition to the challenges of race and indenture, there were also gendered aspects to the treatment of indentured servants. Female indentured servants, in particular, faced a variety of challenges, including sexual abuse, pregnancy, and limited opportunities for social and economic mobility. Many female servants were also responsible for domestic tasks, such as cooking and cleaning, in addition to their other duties. The treatment of indentured servants also varied depending on the location and industry in which they worked. In the southern colonies, for example, indentured servants were often used to work on plantations, where they faced grueling labor and harsh conditions. In the northern colonies, indentured servants were often used as laborers in the growing textile industry. The conditions in which indentured servants lived and worked were also shaped by broader economic and social forces. For example, during times of economic hardship or social unrest, indentured servants were often blamed for the problems facing the colony. This led to increased mistreatment and discrimination towards indentured servants. Despite these challenges, many indentured servants were able to carve out a new life for themselves in the colonies. Some were able to save enough money to start their own businesses or acquire land, while others were able to move up the social and economic ladder. However, for many servants, their time in indenture was a period of struggle and hardship, and their legacy is often overlooked in the broader history of the United States. One important legacy of indentured servitude is the way in which it helped to shape the culture and economy of the United States. The experiences of indentured servants helped to create a distinct working-class culture that emphasized hard work, self-reliance, and resilience in the face of adversity. This culture has been an enduring part of American life, shaping everything from politics and economics to popular culture and everyday life. The legacy of indentured servitude can also be seen in the ongoing struggles for social and economic justice in the United States. The persistent inequalities that exist in our society, particularly along lines of race and class, can be traced back in part to the legacy of forced labor and indenture. Acknowledging and understanding this legacy is an important step towards working towards a more just and equitable society. Where they were sent. Indentured servants were sent to various colonies in the Americas, including the British colonies in North America and the Caribbean. The majority of indentured servants were sent to the British colonies in North America, including Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts. Virginia was one of the most popular destinations for indentured servants in the 17th century. The colony had a labor shortage due to the high mortality rates among the early settlers, and indentured servants were seen as a solution to this problem. Indentured servants were primarily used to work on tobacco plantations, which were the main source of income for the colony. Maryland was also a popular destination for indentured servants in the 17th century. The colony had a similar labor shortage to Virginia, and indentured servants were brought in to work on tobacco plantations. However, Maryland was also a center for iron production, and many indentured servants were sent to work in the iron industry. Pennsylvania was another important destination for indentured servants in the 18th century. The colony was known for its religious tolerance and emphasis on hard work, and many indentured servants were attracted to the opportunities for social and economic mobility that Pennsylvania offered. Indentured servants were used in a variety of industries in Pennsylvania, including agriculture, mining, and manufacturing. In addition to the British colonies in North America, indentured servants were also sent to the Caribbean. The Caribbean colonies, including Barbados, Jamaica, and Trinidad, were important centers for sugar production, and indentured servants were brought in to work on the sugar plantations. The conditions on the sugar plantations in the Caribbean were often even harsher than those in the British colonies in North America, and many indentured servants faced brutal treatment and high mortality rates. Indentured servants were also sent to other parts of the Americas, including South America and the West Indies. In South America, indentured servants were used primarily in the mining industry, while in the West Indies, they were used in a variety of industries, including agriculture and manufacturing. The destinations for indentured servants varied depending on a variety of factors, including the economic needs of the colonies, the availability of land and resources, and the cultural and social norms of the time. However, regardless of the destination, indentured servants faced a variety of challenges and hardships, including grueling labor, poor living conditions, and limited legal rights and protections. Indentured servitude was a complex system that varied over time and place, and the experiences of individual indentured servants varied widely. However, there are several common themes that can be seen in the historical record. One of the key challenges facing indentured servants was the length of their contracts. Indentured servitude contracts typically lasted for 4 to 7 years, and during this time, indentured servants were bound to their masters and had limited legal rights and protections. This meant that they could not easily leave their masters or seek redress for mistreatment, and many indentured servants faced physical abuse, poor living conditions, and inadequate food and clothing. In addition to these challenges, indentured servants also faced cultural and linguistic barriers. Many indentured servants came from non-English speaking countries and had little knowledge of English customs and laws. This made it difficult for them to communicate with their masters and integrate into English society. Furthermore, indentured servants were often stigmatized by English colonists, who saw them as inferior and untrustworthy. Despite these challenges, indentured servants were able to form communities and support networks with each other. Many indentured servants worked together on the same plantation or in the same industry, and they often formed close bonds with each other based on shared experiences and cultural backgrounds. In some cases, indentured servants were even able to form alliances with other groups, such as enslaved Africans, to resist mistreatment and exploitation. One example of such resistance can be seen in the case of Bacon's Rebellion, which occurred in Virginia in 1676. The rebellion was led by Nathaniel Bacon, a wealthy planter who was angry about the governor's failure to protect Virginia settlers from Native American attacks. Bacon and his supporters, who included both enslaved Africans and indentured servants, staged a revolt against the governor and the colonial government. Although the rebellion was ultimately unsuccessful, it showed that indentured servants and other marginalized groups could unite to challenge the power of the colonial elite. Another challenge facing indentured servants was the uncertainty of their futures. Many indentured servants were young men and women who had left their homes in search of a better life. However, once they arrived in the Americas, they found themselves bound to a master and with limited prospects for advancement. While some indentured servants were able to gain their freedom and start new lives as independent farmers or tradespeople, many others found themselves in a cycle of poverty and debt. Despite these challenges, indentured servitude played an important role in the development of the American colonies. Indentured servants provided a source of cheap labor that helped fuel the growth of the colonies and contributed to the development of industries such as agriculture, mining, and manufacturing. Furthermore, many indentured servants were able to use their experience in the colonies to build new lives for themselves and their families, contributing to the diversity and richness of American culture. In the long term, however, the system of indentured servitude proved unsustainable. As the colonies grew and the demand for labor increased, the supply of indentured servants began to dwindle. Furthermore, many indentured servants began to chafe under the restrictions of their contracts and the limitations of their legal status. These factors, combined with the growing demand for enslaved labor, led to the gradual demise of the system of indentured servitude and the rise of chattel slavery in the Americas. Today, the legacy of indentured servitude can still be seen in American culture and society. The experiences of indentured servants helped shape the economic, social, and political landscape of the early American colonies, and their struggles and achievements continue to inspire and inform our understanding of the complex history of race, labor, and power in the United States. What did they have to do? Indentured servants were bound to their masters by a contract that specified the terms of their service. The specific duties and responsibilities of indentured servants varied depending on their location, occupation, and the demands of their masters. However, there were some common tasks and responsibilities that were expected of most indentured servants. One of the primary duties of indentured servants was labor. Indentured servants were typically employed in industries such as agriculture, mining, and manufacturing, where they worked long hours performing physically demanding tasks. For example, indentured servants on plantations were responsible for clearing land, planting crops, and harvesting crops, while those in the manufacturing sector were responsible for operating machines, assembling goods, and performing other manual labor. In addition to their labor duties, indentured servants were also expected to abide by the rules and regulations set forth by their masters. This often meant adhering to strict schedules and routines, as well as maintaining a certain level of cleanliness and hygiene. Indentured servants were also required to attend church services and participate in religious activities, as religion was an important part of daily life in many colonial societies. Indentured servants were also responsible for providing their own basic needs, such as food, clothing, and shelter. However, their masters were required to provide them with the tools and equipment necessary to perform their work duties. In some cases, indentured servants were also provided with a small allowance or payment in exchange for their labor. The daily life of an indentured servant was often difficult and regimented. Indentured servants had limited freedom and autonomy, and their lives were largely dictated by the demands of their masters. They had little control over their living conditions or the tasks they were assigned to perform, and they were often subject to mistreatment and abuse by their masters. Despite these challenges, many indentured servants were able to find ways to make the most of their situation. Some formed close bonds with other indentured servants or members of their communities, while others were able to gain valuable skills and experience that helped them later in life. While the experience of being an indentured servant was often challenging and difficult, it also provided many opportunities for personal growth and development. It is important to note that the experiences of indentured servants varied depending on a number of factors, including their gender, race, and social status. For example, women who were indentured servants often faced additional challenges, such as sexual harassment and exploitation, and were often subject to stricter rules and regulations than their male counterparts. Similarly, indentured servants who were of African descent or who were Native American often faced even greater levels of discrimination and mistreatment, as they were viewed as inferior or uncivilized by many colonial society. Moreover, while indentured servitude was initially intended to be a temporary form of labor, many indentured servants found themselves in extended periods of servitude due to a number of factors. For example, some were unable to pay off their debts or secure their freedom, while others were forcibly extended their contracts by their masters. This led to the development of a permanent underclass of indentured servants who had little hope of achieving social mobility or improving their economic prospects. Indentured servitude also played a significant role in the development of American culture and society. Many of the practices and traditions that are now considered to be quintessentially American, such as Thanksgiving, can be traced back to the experiences of indentured servants and the communities they formed. Similarly, the legacy of indentured servitude has had a profound impact on American law and politics, shaping debates over issues such as immigration, labor rights, and civil rights. In recent years, there has been renewed interest in the experiences of indentured servants and the legacy of indentured servitude. Scholars, activists, and artists have sought to uncover the hidden histories of indentured servants, reclaim their stories and experiences, and explore the ongoing impact of indentured servitude on American society. This work has involved a range of approaches, from archival research and historical scholarship to oral history and community-based activism. One of the lasting legacies of indentured servitude in America is the impact it had on immigration patterns and debates over immigration policy. Many of the early colonists were themselves indentured servants, and their experiences shaped their views on labor and immigration. For example, some early colonial leaders argued that indentured servitude was necessary to provide the labor needed to develop the colonies, while others argued that it was a form of exploitation that harmed both the indentured servants themselves and the larger society. Over time, indentured servitude gave way to other forms of labor, such as slavery and wage labor. However, the debates over immigration and labor rights that were sparked by indentured servitude continued to shape American politics and society. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, debates over immigration centered on issues such as the perceived threat posed by foreign-born workers to American jobs and the need to protect American workers from exploitation. These debates were often racialized, with immigrants from certain countries or regions being seen as more or less desirable based on their perceived cultural or racial characteristics. For example, Chinese immigrants were subject to a series of discriminatory laws that effectively banned them from entering the country, while immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe were subjected to harsh scrutiny and suspicion. Today, debates over immigration and labor rights continue to shape American politics and society, with issues such as guest worker programs, the rights of undocumented workers, and the role of immigrant labor in the economy remaining contentious. The experiences of indentured servants provide an important historical context for these debates, reminding us of the ways in which immigration and labor policy have been shaped by questions of power, exploitation, and identity. Another lasting impact of indentured servitude in America is the role it played in shaping American culture and society. Many of the customs and traditions that are now considered to be quintessentially American can be traced back to the experiences of indentured servants and the communities they formed. For example, the Thanksgiving holiday has its roots in the early colonial practice of holding harvest festivals to celebrate the end of the growing season. These festivals often brought together colonists, Native Americans, and indentured servants, creating a sense of shared community and celebration. Similarly, the music, food, and language of America have been shaped by the experiences of indentured servants and other immigrant communities. From the Irish fiddle tunes of Appalachia to the African rhythms of the South, the diverse cultural heritage of America owes much to the contributions of those who were once indentured servants. The legacy of indentured servitude in America also includes the ongoing struggles for labor rights and economic justice. While the system of indentured servitude is no longer in place, workers in America continue to face many of the same challenges that indentured servants faced, including exploitation, discrimination, and a lack of access to economic opportunities. In recent years, there has been a renewed interest in the experiences of workers in America and the ongoing struggles for labor rights and economic justice. This work has involved a range of approaches, from community-based activism and organizing to academic research and policy advocacy. When would they gain freedom? Indentured servants typically gained their freedom after completing their term of service, which usually lasted between 4 and 7 years. The terms of the indenture contract were agreed upon before the servant left their home country, and they were usually binding for the entire duration of the contract. The indenture contract typically required the servant to work for their master for a specific period of time, in exchange for which the master would provide them with food, clothing, and shelter. After completing their term of service, the indentured servant would be free to leave their master and pursue their own economic opportunities. In some cases, indentured servants were able to gain their freedom before the end of their term of service. This could happen if the master died or if the servant was able to prove that they had been mistreated or abused. In some cases, indentured servants were able to buy their way out of their contract, usually by agreeing to pay a certain amount of money to their master. However, for many indentured servants, the reality was that they had little control over their own lives and were subject to abuse and exploitation. They were often treated harshly by their masters, who had almost complete control over their lives and could punish them for even minor infractions. This meant that many indentured servants were forced to remain in service for longer than their initial term, or to accept unfavorable conditions in order to avoid being punished. Indentured servitude began to decline in the late 17th century, as the number of new immigrants to the American colonies began to decline and the demand for labor began to shift towards other forms of labor, such as slavery. As a result, many indentured servants found it difficult to find work after their term of service was over, and some were forced to remain in servitude in order to survive. Despite the challenges they faced, indentured servants played a critical role in the development of the American colonies, providing the labor necessary to build homes, clear land, and plant crops. Their experiences also helped to shape the political, social, and economic structures of early America, and their legacy continues to shape debates over immigration, labor rights, and economic justice in America today. Indentured servitude played a significant role in the early economic and social development of the American colonies. Although it was a form of labor that involved the temporary servitude of individuals, it was crucial in providing the necessary labor that was required to build the foundations of the colonies. Indentured servants came from different backgrounds, with many being recruited from England, Ireland, Scotland, and other European countries. They were typically poor individuals who saw the promise of a better life in the American colonies. Many were young men and women who were seeking to escape poverty and make a new start in life. However, others were convicts, debtors, and others who were forced into indentured servitude as a form of punishment. The conditions under which indentured servants worked were often harsh and unforgiving. They were expected to work long hours, and they had to endure difficult living conditions. Their masters had almost complete control over their lives, and they could punish them for even the slightest infraction. Indentured servants had no legal rights, and they could not leave their masters until their term of service was completed. Despite the challenges that they faced, indentured servants played a critical role in the development of the American colonies. They helped to clear the land, build homes and other structures, and plant crops. They also worked in the fields and mines, performing the manual labor that was necessary for the economic growth of the colonies. The system of indentured servitude was not without its problems, however. Many indentured servants were mistreated and abused, and they had little legal recourse. Some masters would force their servants to work longer than their agreed-upon term, or they would force them to accept harsh working conditions in exchange for the promise of freedom. Furthermore, the system of indentured servitude was based on the exploitation of vulnerable individuals who were seeking a better life. Many of these individuals were tricked into signing contracts that they did not fully understand, and they were often subjected to deceptive practices by unscrupulous agents who were recruiting indentured servants. Despite these problems, however, the system of indentured servitude helped to lay the foundations for the economic and social development of the American colonies. It provided a source of labor that was critical in the early years of the colonies, and it helped to shape the political and economic structures of early America. Over time, the system of indentured servitude began to decline, and it was eventually replaced by other forms of labor, such as slavery. However, the legacy of indentured servitude continues to shape debates over immigration, labor rights, and economic justice in America today. It serves as a reminder of the struggles and sacrifices that were made by early immigrants and laborers in the pursuit of a better life in America. One of the most significant challenges faced by indentured servants was the uncertainty of their future. They were promised freedom and land at the end of their term of service, but many never received it. Some servants died before their contract ended, while others were cheated by their masters, who refused to provide them with the promised rewards. The conditions of indentured servitude varied depending on the region and the type of work. Servants working on plantations in the South, for example, were subjected to back-breaking work in the fields, while those working in urban areas often worked in workshops or as domestic servants. Regardless of the type of work, however, indentured servants were subject to the arbitrary authority of their masters, who could beat, whip, or otherwise punish them for disobedience or poor performance. Indentured servants were also subjected to various forms of exploitation by their masters. For example, some masters would deliberately extend the length of the contract in order to keep their servants in servitude for a longer period of time. Others would sell the indenture contracts to other masters, who would then take possession of the servant without the servant's consent. Despite these challenges, indentured servitude was a relatively common practice in the early years of the American colonies. By the early 1700s, however, the number of indentured servants began to decline, as the demand for labor shifted towards African slaves. The decline of indentured servitude was due to several factors. First, the population of the colonies began to grow, leading to a greater demand for labor. Second, the increasing availability of African slaves made it easier and more cost-effective for plantation owners to rely on slave labor. Finally, the increasing number of immigrants coming to the colonies led to a greater demand for wage labor, which was seen as a more desirable option than indentured servitude. Despite its decline, however, indentured servitude left a lasting impact on the history of the American colonies. It helped to shape the economic and social structures of early America, and provided a way for many Europeans to make a new life in the colonies. It also had a significant impact on the development of race and class in America, as indentured servitude laid the groundwork for the system of chattel slavery that was to come. In terms of race, indentured servitude was notable for its relative lack of racial barriers. While the majority of indentured servants were white Europeans, there were also significant numbers of African and Native American servants as well. This diversity was largely due to the fact that indentured servitude was based on the principle of contractual obligation, rather than on any inherent racial or ethnic characteristics. However, as the demand for labor shifted towards African slaves, racial barriers became increasingly significant. African slaves were seen as a more desirable option than indentured servants, as they were perceived as being more reliable and easier to control. This shift in labor demand helped to create the racial hierarchy that would come to define American society for centuries to come. In terms of class, indentured servitude also played a significant role in the development of American society. Indentured servants were often poor, uneducated, and without any significant social or economic resources. Their lack of resources made them vulnerable to exploitation by their masters, who could easily take advantage of their dependent status. However, the experience of indentured servitude also provided opportunities for social and economic mobility. Many indentured servants were able to gain valuable skills and experience during their time of service, which allowed them to transition into other forms of labor or to start their own businesses. This mobility helped to create a more fluid social and economic structure in the colonies, which was in stark contrast to the rigid social hierarchies of Europe. Despite its many challenges, indentured servitude played an important role in the development of the American colonies. It provided a way for many Europeans to start a new life in America, and helped to shape the economic and social structures of early America. While the legacy of indentured servitude is complex and often controversial, it remains an important part of the history of the United States. How many had relationships with slaves from other countries? The question of how many indentured servants had relationships with slaves from other countries is difficult to answer definitively. There is no comprehensive data on the number of such relationships, and historical accounts are often incomplete or contradictory. That said, it is clear that there were instances of such relationships occurring. Given the fact that both indentured servants and slaves were often living in close proximity on plantations and other work sites, it is reasonable to assume that some level of interaction occurred between the two groups. One notable example of such a relationship is the story of John Kaser, who was an indentured servant in Virginia in the mid-17th century. Kaser was a black man who had been brought to Virginia from Angola, and was initially owned by a fellow black man named Anthony Johnson. However, after his term of service was up, Kaser refused to leave Johnson's property and claimed that he was still legally bound to Johnson as a slave. Johnson took Kaser to court, and the court ruled in his favor, making Kaser the first legally recognized slave in Virginia. While the story of John Kaser is certainly a complicated one, it is notable for the way it illustrates the complex relationships that existed between indentured servants and slaves in the early colonies. Kaser was a black man who had served as an indentured servant, but was ultimately treated as a slave due to the legal and social structures of the time. Another example of such a relationship is the story of Mary Johnson, an indentured servant in the early 18th century who was accused of having a sexual relationship with a black slave. Johnson was tried and convicted of fornication and ordered to pay a fine. While the details of the case are unclear, it is clear that Johnson had some sort of relationship with the slave in question, and that the legal system was willing to punish her for it. It is also worth noting that the issue of interracial relationships between indentured servants and slaves was not solely limited to those from different countries. There were also instances of relationships between indentured servants and slaves of the same race, but different social and legal statuses. For example, in the early colonies, there were often large numbers of white indentured servants and black slaves living and working in close proximity. While legal prohibitions against interracial marriage and sexual relationships were in place, these laws were often ignored or circumvented. In some cases, indentured servants and slaves would enter into consensual relationships, often in secret. These relationships could be complicated by a number of factors, including the power dynamics inherent in a relationship between a free person and a slave. In some cases, masters may have used their power over their slaves to coerce them into sexual relationships, while in other cases, indentured servants may have used their relative freedom to manipulate or take advantage of slaves. Nonetheless, the fact that such relationships occurred at all is a testament to the resilience and adaptability of people in difficult circumstances. In a society that was often deeply divided along lines of race, class, and legal status, these relationships represented a means of finding connection and intimacy in an often hostile world. It is also worth noting that the issue of relationships between indentured servants and slaves did not disappear with the end of the indentured servitude system. Even after slavery was abolished, racial segregation and discrimination remained pervasive in American society, and interracial relationships continued to be stigmatized and legally restricted. It was not until the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 1970s that significant progress was made in dismantling these legal and social barriers. Today, while there is still much work to be done to address issues of systemic racism and inequality, interracial relationships are increasingly common and socially accepted. However, they also represented a means of finding connection and intimacy in a difficult and often hostile world, and are a testament to the resilience and adaptability of people in difficult circumstances. By understanding the complex social dynamics that existed between indentured servants and slaves in the early colonies, we can gain a greater appreciation for the challenges that these people faced, and the ways in which they sought to make a life for themselves in a new and unfamiliar land. It is also important to consider the impact that indentured servitude had on the broader economic and social landscape of the early American colonies. Indentured servants represented a significant source of labor for colonial landowners, who relied on them to clear land, plant crops, and perform other essential tasks. However, the system of indentured servitude also had a number of negative consequences. For one, it created a pool of workers who were easily exploitable and subject to abuse by their masters. Because indentured servants were legally bound to their masters for a set period of time, they had little recourse if they were mistreated or denied basic rights. Additionally, the system of indentured servitude contributed to a growing economic inequality between landowners and workers. While landowners were able to accumulate wealth and build large plantations, many indentured servants found themselves stuck in a cycle of debt and poverty, unable to make a better life for themselves. Moreover, the system of indentured servitude played a significant role in the growth of the slave trade in the American colonies. As the demand for labor grew, landowners began to turn to the slave trade as a source of cheap, reliable labor. This led to the rise of large-scale slave plantations, which would go on to play a central role in the development of the American economy and society. By studying the history of indentured servitude, we can gain a greater understanding of the challenges that early colonists faced, and the ways in which they sought to build a new society in a new and unfamiliar land. We can also gain a deeper appreciation for the resilience and adaptability of people in difficult circumstances, and for the ways in which they were able to forge new relationships and communities in the face of adversity. How indentured people became white to interact in countries after their freedom. The issue of race and identity among indentured servants in the early American colonies is a complex and multifaceted one. While many indentured servants were European, and therefore considered white by contemporary standards, others came from a variety of racial and ethnic backgrounds, including Native American, African, and Asian. For those indentured servants who were not European, the process of becoming white after their period of servitude was often a fraught one. In many cases, these individuals had to navigate a complex and discriminatory social hierarchy that placed people of European descent at the top, and people of color at the bottom. One way in which indentured servants of non-European descent attempted to navigate this hierarchy was by passing as white. This involved adopting the cultural practices and social norms of white society, and attempting to blend in with the dominant group. Some individuals were able to do this successfully, and were able to establish themselves as members of white society after their period of servitude ended. However, passing was not always a viable option for everyone. For one, it required individuals to essentially abandon their cultural and ethnic heritage, which could be a deeply traumatic and difficult process. Additionally, Passing was often contingent on having a certain physical appearance, which not everyone had. For those who were unable or unwilling to pass, the process of reintegrating into society after their period of servitude was often fraught with discrimination and prejudice. It is important to note that the process of becoming white after indentured servitude was not just a matter of individual choice or circumstance. Rather, it was shaped by larger historical and cultural forces, including the development of a racial hierarchy that placed people of European descent at the top, and the legacy of slavery and colonialism. In many ways, the process of becoming white after indentured servitude mirrored the process that many European immigrants underwent as they assimilated into American society. These immigrants were able to establish themselves as white by adopting the cultural practices and social norms of dominant American society, and by distancing themselves from other groups, such as African Americans and Native Americans. However, for non-European indentured servants, the process of becoming white was much more complicated, as they had to navigate a complex and often contradictory set of expectations and standards. On the one hand, they were expected to assimilate into white society and adopt its norms and values. On the other hand, they were often excluded and marginalized on the basis of their race and ethnicity, and faced significant barriers to social and economic mobility. In many cases, non-European indentured servants were able to establish themselves as members of white society by adopting a variety of strategies. Some adopted European names and languages, while others converted to Christianity or married into white families. Still others used their skills and labor to gain a foothold in the economy, and were eventually able to establish themselves as members of the middle class. Despite these efforts, however, non-European indentured servants were often excluded from the full benefits of white society, and faced discrimination and prejudice on the basis of their race and ethnicity. This was especially true for African American indentured servants, who faced a particularly challenging set of circumstances in the early American colonies. African American indentured servants were often subject to even harsher treatment than their European counterparts, and faced significant barriers to social and economic mobility. They were often viewed as property rather than people, and were subjected to brutal physical punishment and sexual exploitation. In addition, they were often forced to work in the most dangerous and physically demanding jobs, such as mining and agriculture. Despite these challenges, however, many African American indentured servants were able to establish themselves as members of white society. This was due in part to the fact that they were often lighter-skinned and more culturally familiar to white Americans than their African-born counterparts. In addition, some African American indentured servants were able to use their skills and labor to gain a foothold in the economy, and were eventually able to establish themselves as members of the middle class. One of the key factors that allowed non-European indentured servants to establish themselves as members of white society was the development of a racial hierarchy that placed people of European descent at the top. This hierarchy was reinforced by a range of cultural and legal practices, including segregation, discrimination, and violence against non-white groups. As a result, non-European indentured servants who were able to assimilate into white society often did so at the expense of their own cultural heritage and identity. They were forced to adopt European names, languages, and religions, and were often discouraged or forbidden from maintaining ties to their own communities and traditions. This process of assimilation was not unique to indentured servants, but was a broader feature of American society in the 19th and early 20th centuries. However, for indentured servants, the process of becoming white was often a matter of survival, as it allowed them to gain access to the economic and social benefits of dominant American society. Despite this, many indentured servants continued to face discrimination and prejudice even after they had established themselves as members of white society. This was especially true for those who were not of European descent, and who were often subjected to racist attitudes and beliefs. However, it is important to note that the process of becoming white was not available or desirable to all indentured servants. Some chose to maintain their cultural heritage and identity, and sought to create communities and networks that were based on shared experiences and traditions. In addition, it is worth noting that the process of becoming white was not necessarily a one-way street. As the racial and ethnic makeup of the United States has evolved over time, the boundaries between different racial and ethnic groups have become increasingly fluid and complex. Today, many individuals who are descended from non-European indentured servants have chosen to embrace their cultural heritage and identity, and are working to reclaim the stories and traditions that were lost or suppressed during the process of assimilation. This process of cultural revival and reclamation is an important part of the ongoing effort to acknowledge and address the legacy of indentured servitude and slavery in the United States. Furthermore, it is important to recognize that the experiences of indentured servants were not limited to the United States. Indentured servitude was a common practice throughout the British Empire, and was used to exploit and control people in colonies across the globe. Today, many countries are grappling with the legacy of indentured servitude, and are working to address the ongoing inequalities and injustices that are the result of this system. This work is complex and challenging, but is essential for creating a more just and equitable world. Why the Anglo-Saxon controlled indentured and sold slaves? The Anglo-Saxon control of indentured servitude and the slave trade can be traced back to a combination of economic and social factors. In the early years of European colonization in the Americas, labor was in short supply, and European landowners were struggling to find a reliable and affordable workforce to cultivate their crops and extract resources from the land. One of the solutions to this problem was indentured servitude, which involved recruiting poor and often desperate individuals from Europe to work for a fixed period of time in exchange for passage to the New World and the promise of land and other rewards upon completion of their term. However, as the demand for labor continued to grow, many landowners turned to the transatlantic slave trade as a more reliable and cost-effective means of securing a workforce. This involved the forced transportation of millions of enslaved Africans to the New World, where they were sold and forced to work on plantations and in other labor-intensive industries. The control of both indentured servitude and the slave trade gave Anglo-Saxon landowners and merchants immense economic and social power, allowing them to accumulate vast wealth and exert significant influence over colonial governments and societies. This power was reinforced by a complex system of racial and ethnic hierarchies, which positioned Europeans at the top of the social order and relegated people of color to subordinate positions. At the same time, the control of indentured servitude and the slave trade was also shaped by broader historical and cultural factors. European imperialism, for example, was driven by a desire for wealth, power, and prestige, and was often justified through a belief in the superiority of European culture and values. This belief in European superiority was also reflected in the ways in which indentured servants and slaves were treated. Both groups were subjected to brutal working conditions, harsh punishments, and other forms of violence and exploitation, which were justified through a belief in the innate inferiority of non-European peoples. Over time, however, resistance and rebellion by indentured servants, slaves, and other marginalized groups challenged the power of Anglo-Saxon landowners and merchants, and helped to lay the foundations for the modern struggles for freedom, justice, and equality. Today, the legacy of Anglo-Saxon control of indentured servitude and the slave trade continues to be felt around the world, as communities work to address the ongoing inequalities and injustices that are the result of centuries of exploitation and oppression. By recognizing and addressing these legacies, we can begin to create a more just and equitable world for all. One important factor that contributed to the Anglo-Saxon control of indentured servitude and the slave trade was the emergence of a capitalist economy in Europe. Capitalism is an economic system that is based on the accumulation of wealth through the private ownership and control of the means of production, such as land, resources, and labor. As European societies became more capitalistic, there was a growing demand for labor to support the expansion of industry, trade, and commerce. This demand for labor was especially acute in the colonies, where European landowners and merchants needed a reliable and cost-effective workforce to extract resources and create wealth. Indentured servitude and the slave trade were two of the ways that European capitalists were able to meet this demand for labor. Indentured servants were often recruited from among the poor and unemployed in Europe, and were promised land, food, and other rewards in exchange for working for a fixed period of time in the colonies. The transatlantic slave trade, on the other hand, involved the forced transportation of millions of Africans to the New World, where they were sold into slavery and forced to work on plantations and in other industries. Both indentured servants and slaves were subjected to brutal working conditions and harsh punishments, but slaves were seen as a more reliable and cost-effective source of labor, since they could be bought and sold like property and had no legal rights or protections. Another important factor that contributed to the Anglo-Saxon control of indentured servitude and the slave trade was the emergence of a racial and ethnic hierarchy in colonial societies. This hierarchy positioned Europeans at the top of the social order, and relegated people of color, including indentured servants and slaves, to subordinate positions. This hierarchy was reinforced through a variety of cultural and social practices, such as laws that restricted the rights and freedoms of people of color, and social norms that promoted the idea of European superiority and non-European inferiority. This cultural and social hierarchy helped to justify the exploitation and oppression of indentured servants and slaves, and allowed Anglo-Saxon landowners and merchants to maintain their economic and social power. However, the control of indentured servitude and the slave trade was not absolute, and there were many instances of resistance and rebellion by indentured servants, slaves, and other marginalized groups. These rebellions often took the form of labor strikes, revolts, and uprisings, and were sometimes successful in winning concessions from colonial authorities or even securing freedom. One of the most famous examples of resistance by indentured servants and slaves was the Stono Rebellion, which took place in South Carolina in 1739. In this rebellion, a group of slaves led by a man named Jemmy attempted to escape to Florida, where they hoped to find freedom and refuge among the Spanish. Although the rebellion was ultimately unsuccessful, it highlighted the deep-seated grievances and resentments that were felt by many enslaved Africans, and helped to fuel the broader movement for abolition and emancipation that would eventually lead to the end of slavery in the Americas.